Hi, David. Hi, Rick. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Vonvo.com. The date is March 17th, 2013, and we are here to discuss U.S. budget cuts as well as a little twist with some government corruption. I just wanted to go over two quick ground rules before we got started. The first is that right now this conversation is being recorded, and after the recording is completed, I'll be uploading this video to the internet, to our YouTube channel. Are both of you fine with that?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Great. And then on top of that, here at Vonvo, we are all about our discussions staying both civil and valuable. We don't want there to be any personal attacks against anyone inside the chat. Are you guys fine with those ground rules?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Okay, so then let's get our conversation started. If you wouldn't mind, could each of you guys give a quick background of yourself and why this particular subject, makes you so passionate? And David, you can go first, and then Rick.
I'm a political science student at Northeastern University. I served 4 years in the U.S. military, and in terms of the budget, I think it's pretty much the core of our government.
Cool.
And how it operates. Yeah.
Cool. And Rick, go ahead.
I also served in the U.S. military, and after that I was a psychiatrist for the VA. I have a lot of experience with veterans and the problems that they suffer as a result of their military service. I actually resigned from the VA to run for the U.S. Senate because I believe people like me have to get involved in politics in order to create the change that will enable us to stop relying on war as a means to impose the will of, frankly, powerful people, international financiers in particular, who control the U.S. government and use its military to try to control the rest of the world. So I started a nonprofit called Take Back America for the People. We educate people on the costs of allowing corporations to run our government. And I started something called Soldiers for Peace International, which is, as it implies, an international group of social justice activists who believe that we can end war by looking for justice in our nations, our communities, and the world at large.
Cool. Great. So, in regards to the recent U.S. budget cuts, and I guess, we can kind of begin with this item and then sort of move into this whole government corruption idea, and if we move into it quicker than we thought, that's fine. David, when a few weeks back when these cuts took place on March 1st, I mean, what was your overall impression and feelings regarding that?
Well, first of all, you just have to realize that this isn't smart government. It's really just sloppy, and it serves no purpose. You have to realize that there's two overall goals. One, to reduce our overall debt, and to do that, we have to cut our deficits. But we also have to grow the economy, and we also need jobs. And this isn't pro-growth. It's not going to create jobs. It's actually going to hurt our economy. So my thoughts on the sequester is that it's not going to help us. It's not necessary, and it's counterproductive.
Right, and Rick, feel free to go back and forth with David. I'll just be here to listen in.
Sure, I think David pretty much hit the nail on the head for the most part. The problem is taxpayers have been saddled with excessive debt, basically because our money supply, our money supply and our currency supply are controlled by a group of international bankers. Some of them based here in the United States and others in Europe. We've basically given away sovereignty by that. We've made the whole nation a nation of debt slaves. The same thing has happened in Europe. The same thing has happened throughout Asia and has happened in Africa. And basically, the idea is to make it happen all over the world. And the governments that are resisting, the government of Libya that was resisting, they used to have their own bank owned by the people. Since they've been taken over, one of the first things they did was establish basically a Rothschild's bank, one of the banks that's allied with the other central banks of Europe and the United States. And that is one of the main objectives of these international corporate terrorists who are trying to basically economically enslave us in a fascist New World Order. So I think David was right on. The one thing I do just...
Rick, are you there? David, do you hear Rick?
I don't hear him at all.
Okay. Well, actually, now I'm not even seeing him inside the chat room. So perhaps his internet might have burnt out for a second. So hopefully he'll be able to come right back in. So David, some of the things that Rick's bringing up, New World Order sort of items. I mean, are these things that you happen to believe in? I mean, do you think that these are far-fetched concepts? And I mean, actually, Rick's coming back in. Rick, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, do you want to? I didn't. We heard that New World Order comment. If you want to continue where you left off there, or wherever you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, what I was commenting on is the idea that we have to get past the idea of an economy based on endless growth. As you know, I have my own radio shows. I have two of them. One, Taking Back America, which is a podcast network show, and the other one is SFPI Radio, which is an internet-based. And we have talked about this many times. I have a friend, Rob Dietz, here in the United States, who was or in Oregon actually, who was the executive director of the Center for the Advancement of a Self-Sustaining Economy, or a steady-state economy. The idea there is that we have to figure out a way to develop an economy that's not based on endless growth, because our resources are finite. And this is one of the main reasons that drives war. War is about control of resources. That's how we control other nations, and the people of the United States are not benefiting from it. Those 90% of the wealth created in the last 10 years went to the top 1%. Where's our cut? I mean, what are we getting out of this? We are getting the bills for these endless wars. We are getting higher gas prices, and it's all to maintain a fossil fuel-based economy that is destroying the planet environmentally, or at least threatening human civilization. The planet will survive. The question is whether civilization will.
David, do you have any thoughts that you want to, bounce off of Rick from what he just said?
I mean, yeah, I think he's absolutely correct. It's not really New World Order thing. It's really, you can look at the petrodollar situation with Iraq, Iran, and Libya, and as soon as a country decides that they're not gonna use U.S. petrodollars, and they want to go to the euro, or they want to go through the dinar or whatever, gold. Anytime that happens, the U.S. is threatened economically. So you see us try to flex our muscles on those countries. We invaded Iraq almost instantly after Saddam decided not to use oil with U.S. dollars. We're pressuring Iran for very similar reasons. And he also made a great point with this concept of nonstop growth. It's really, that concept doesn't exist. You have the world economy, and when you see growth in certain areas, you're actually going to see more poverty, more oppression in other areas, and it's happening in the United States where you have this income inequality. You'll see that the very rich will do really well, whereas the poor will get poorer and poorer, and even you'll see it happen to the middle class. There's really not a middle class in this country anymore. It's really a working class and a really impoverished. Like you're comparing what we would consider lower class is really people living in poverty. And then you have working class who are essentially the middle class now. And it's only going to get worse with increased globalization, and as oil demand increases in China, India, and other developing nations start using oil to a greater degree, that's just going to drive the oil cost up. And as oil becomes more scarce, it's also going to increase the price. And the only thing that can happen is that it will shrink and more people will enter poverty. It happen in the United States, it'll happen in Europe. There's really no avoiding it unless we rely completely on oil as a source of economy.
So my, just because I'm going to come in here and ask a question. So, what do you guys suggest in terms of not reliant on a non-growth or, a non-growth economy? I mean, what are your alternative suggestions?
You want me to start, Max?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, first I want to respond to a comment made in the chat room. Somebody seems to be jumping to the conclusion that we're talking about socialism versus capitalism. That's the kind of black and white thinking that makes it hard to have a conversation like this. First of all, socialism is a system of economics. It's not necessarily a system of government. People tend to equate it with communism. They equate it with ownership of the means of production by the state. Well, that's only one form of socialism, and it hasn't worked. I agree with that. But people have to realize that really democratic socialism is the ideal of democracy. So get it straight. These economic systems have nothing to do with democracy. Capitalism is not democratic. And what we're seeing is an assault by these international bankers on democracy itself. And if we don't join together and get past these crazy ideological differences and understand that our interests are the same, then we're never going to be able to create a steady state economy, and we will just simply continue to fall victim to their plans to take over the world. And I think David put it really nicely, what he said.
And yeah, I'll respond to this idea of capitalism versus socialism. It's really much more complex than that. Just as Rick said, when you try to make it a blanket issue about capitalism versus socialism, you're really ignoring the real issue at hand. What I would advocate is actually, I think you mentioned it, social democracy. And it's really the government playing a role in our economy. It's basically what we have now. It's a mixed economy, it's mixed government. But unfortunately, what we see now is you have capitalism essentially running amok, where nations are in control of our government and they have complete control. And that's really not what we were looking for when we set out for capitalism. So social democracy is to fix two problems. The first being the income inequality. There are certain things that we can do to fix income inequality, where you have investments in education and you have investments in infrastructure. That's all social democracy. It's all government spending, but it's government spending that helps everyone and elevates everyone equally. And then the second part of social democracy is investments in energy. You want to invest in renewable energy that isn't oil. So you want solar, you want wind, you want all these other alternatives to oil. So not only did that get us off of this dependency on oil and having to go to war for oil, it was just something that will not only be sustainable, but it's also good for our environment. Like, let's say you don't believe in global warming, you don't buy into it, you can at least look at it economically and understand that oil, there's no economic future in oil. We have to look at something longer term than that. And it's a little myopic to think that our economy that's based on oil can sustain with increased demand in oil and increased prices.
Right.
Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Rick.
We're getting comments in the chat room I'd like to respond to. The person who brought up the issue of socialism versus democracy is asking, how do people make money in a social democracy or under democratic socialism? And he asks, is our dependency on fossil fuels the downfall of democracy? Let me take the second one first because that's easier. Yes, continuing to depend on fossil fuels will lead to the end of, well, we don't have a democracy. Let me say that first. We don't have a real democracy because it's a small group of internationalists who control the government. It's not people. We need to make government of and by and for the people in order to get off fossil fuels. Here's the thing. Fossil fuel production, the evidence is overwhelming that it is leading to global climate change, these weather extremes. Even Bush admitted that global climate change is real. So David pointed out that we have to look at the economics fairly. The costs of Hurricane Sandy, of Hurricane Katrina, the cost of all this environmental destruction is much higher than the cost of developing a green-based energy system. Not only that, but you add in the cost of war, you add in the high energy cost because gasoline prices are being driven up. Natural gas is going to go up if they allow exports. And then all the environmental costs. It is overwhelmingly cheaper to start a Manhattan project, switch over to renewable energy. We can do it. The commitment is practically nil in Congress and in the White House because those politicians depend on donations from corporations and the people that get rich from them in order to stay in office. That's the basic problem, and that's really what we need to focus on. There is a way to take back our government, which we can get into later, but I do want to address the first question because it's a very common question I hear. How do people make money in a democratic socialist society? Well, again, there's all kinds of varieties of socialism. We have democratic socialism already in Europe. Unfortunately, it's been undermined by the international bankers who taint the economy. So in a real social democracy where the people control the government, you do not eliminate competition. You do not eliminate rewards for good performance and adding value to society, improving the quality of life. You do reward that. You want to incentivize that. The difference between that and an unregulated capitalism is that if we, the people, decide we want to have a society where everyone's basic needs are taken care of and everyone has the opportunity to contribute to society and to make that extra money by doing a little bit more, if we create that kind of a society, then we free ourselves from debt slavery. We free ourselves from control by a small group of international elite. So that's real democracy.
Yeah, and going on that, I would just want to say, if you look at our budget and you look at our increased costs, the first thing you have to look at is healthcare. And that's really being ignored by, I guess, both sides, Democrats and Republicans. Republicans really want to focus on cutting Medicare and cutting Social Security. And honestly, I don't think that's the answer. I think that's like ignoring the problem and kind of shifting the burden onto others. And Democrats are also ignoring the real problem that these programs that exist right now have no longevity. And I mean, if you look at Social Security, there's a lot to consider. The fact that we put money into Social Security and yet that money is used to fund general government expenditure. That's one thing that is of concern. But let me focus on healthcare for a second. Someone talked about capitalism earlier, Raphael, and he has to realize that without social democracy in terms of healthcare, we're always going to see rising costs in healthcare to the extent that our overall budget is absorbed by it. It's either the budget is absorbed by healthcare costs, or we simply let people get sick and die. So the answer is social democracy. It is creating a public option or a non-profit healthcare system. that's really the only thing that we can do in terms of the budget long term while taking care of people. Um, and going back to Social Security, I would say that this idea that we can cut Social Security is honestly the same thing with Medicare. Taking the money from the working class in the future so that you can continue spending money on whatever government wants to spend on today. And when you see us spending money on war, and then you ask how we're going to pay for it, we're going to pay for it with the working class, and to whose benefit is this happening? It's only benefiting those who are enjoying the income distribution, which is obviously the top 1%, top 10%. So you have to look at our economy, you have to look at our budget and see what kind of government are we going to be, what kind of society are we going to be? Are we going to sacrifice those that are most vulnerable to capitalism, or are we going to create a system that works for everybody?
I think that's a great point, David. That is the central issue. There's an attack on the social safety net that's been going on by the international corporate terrorists since Roosevelt started the New Deal. Saving Social Security is a no-brainer. All you do is you raise or remove the cap on the Social Security tax, and you can keep going forever. It's no big deal, but the problem is, and that's introduced, by the way, in Congress, the problem is Congress is controlled by politicians who are in the pockets of the rich. So they will protect their interests over the interests of the rest of us. And that, again, is why we absolutely have to take over our own government. And I think we can talk about how to do that later. But I do want to address a little bit more this issue of health care. This is really central, as David said. Our healthcare costs are nearing 20% of the total GDP. 20%, one out of every $5 goes to paying healthcare costs, which are roughly twice as much per person in the United States as anywhere else. Meanwhile, leaving 50 million people, nearly 50 million people uninsured, which is up almost 5 million since Obamacare was passed, or since they started debating Obamacare. So the net result of Obamacare is we have fewer people insured. More and more people can't afford insurance. So if they take the time to fill out the 45-page application form, the taxpayers will subsidize them. We pay the bill either way, but we're not getting universal health care. What we're doing is bailing out the medical insurance industry, which, left to its own in a true free market economy, would have already self-destructed. So this so clearly reveals the corruption of the U.S. government. This is really the thing that led me to quit my job and start working full-time to reform government in the United States. It's absolutely essential, not just for the American economy or the world economy. It's essential for saving human civilization.
Yeah, I see that Raphael, he asked the question, how do you stop big companies from becoming big and dominant in their fields? And I think the government has a certain role to protect the people when a corporation becomes so large that it has a monopoly and leverage over the citizens. In terms of oil, for instance, it includes not having the oil companies dictate research and development in terms of other renewable energy. In terms of like the FCC, the FCC needs to play a role in terms of regulating our media. We have this conglomeration of media where you have 6 companies who own basically everything. So the message is really smaller, and people aren't getting the real clear message. So government has a role to regulate corporations. Raphael asked, should the government control the oil company? The government shouldn't control the oil industry. It should control energy. So you don't let the oil companies create a monopoly on energy. You have the government invest in alternate energy, and you let competition work itself out. No, the thing about Europe moving away from socialized medicine, he also made that comment. The IMF has already admitted that austerity isn't working in Europe, and that it's just making their economic recovery worse. That's not something that we should emulate in the United States. There's just no validity to austerity. The only reason to perform austerity is to benefit the most wealthy. That's really the crux of it.
Absolutely, and the point you're making is that let's go back to the beginning of the argument about why we need universal health care. First of all, if you have to realize if this already worked in other countries, their cost per person are about 50% of.
Hey Rick, you're breaking up a bit. Maybe if you turn off your camera, it'll stream a little bit better. David, did Rick cut off for you also?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, he must be having some internet difficulties. If he turns off his camera, that should help with streaming his video. But I'll tell him that when he comes back in, because I'm sure he's going to get kicked out shortly. So
yeah, one thing
yeah, go ahead, David.
I kind of saw where he was going with that.
Okay.
Europe has been able to implement some social medicine, and it reduces the cost of social medicine in a way that we haven't seen in this country. And that's why we see this increase in our budget in terms of medicine, because we don't control it. There was this piece in Time magazine where they're talking about how something costs, like let's say an MRI machine, it costs $1,000 on your insurance here, but in it could cost $100. The fact that we don't restrict these prices means that we are getting gouged, and no one really realizes it because it's just, oh, it's going toward the insurance companies are paying for it. But you have to realize that that cost is translated into higher premiums, higher healthcare costs, and that also translates into Medicare and Medicaid. So you see these programs becoming much larger than they need to be, because we have this spiraling out of control medical cost system in this country.
Right, and Rick.
Yes, I just want to.
Rick, I was just gonna say, if you click the turn off camera button, I want to say that hopefully your audio will come in just fine, and your video shouldn't time out anymore. He's definitely having troubles with his internet connection. David, so what ultimately, Rick kind of brought it up a few times. What are some of the things that can be done to take back government? I mean, can you go into what reforms, I guess, need to take place?
Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to repeal and overturn Citizens United. That's the first step, and then after that, it's aggressive campaign finance reform. You want the vast majority of money going for campaigning to come from the working class and the vast majority of regular citizens. You don't want an oligopoly. You don't want corporate plutocracy. So to avoid that, you have to have campaign finance reform. Another way you can bring back the democracy for the citizens is to put in term limits. And we have term limits for the president, but we have no term limits for senators. We have no term limits for representatives in the House. So term limits would severely limit this long-term systemic corruption that we have in our government.
Max, let me respond to that. I think David hit the nail on the head there. We need to elect candidates. The people need to elect candidates rather than big money from corporations and rich individuals. And the way to do that is through a constitutional amendment. because that's the only way to overrule the Supreme Court in Citizens United and previous decisions that simply gave a louder voice to corporations and the rich. And there's actually a way to do this. Most people think it's going to take decades to pass a constitutional amendment. First of all, it's that belief that's holding us back. When people realize we can do it and why we have to, then we will. Because the people elect the people that will pass it. In other words, we will pass a constitutional amendment through Congress. How do we do that when congressmen are so corrupted? Well, we make it a campaign issue. We get people to run across the country for Congress, as I did in 2010, pledging to amend the Constitution to achieve campaign finance reform and hopefully abolish corporate personhood at the same time. And if we make that a litmus test in every race across the country, eventually we will elect a Congress that will pass it. And once it passes, I expect it will get through the states in less than 9 months. It will be ratified by the 3/4 of the states in less than 9 months. So there's a way to do it. I call it the Pledge to Amend campaign. Anybody that wants to read about it and tell other people about it, go to soldiersforpeaceinternational.org or just Google Just for Peace International and look at Pledge to Amend. This is a campaign that's really gaining steam now because Move to Amend is, well, they're going to adopt a similar strategy. I haven't seen it yet other than an announcement. But Move to Amend is pushing their own version of an amendment, which I think is inadequate. So there's some competition going on between the various versions of amendments. I encourage people to look at the Bernie Sanders amendment. David, the main thing that we need to accomplish is to make sure that individual donors are the primary contributors to these campaigns. The Sanders amendment limit all political contributions, direct or indirect, to individuals or associations of individuals, like union PACs, like small business PACs, where small business people put right out of their pockets money into political action committees to support candidates they think will support them and their interests. Maybe it would be better if we didn't have PACs, but I don't see that happening. It's not going to happen under the Move to Amend amendment or any of the amendments. This Sanders amendment has union support because it preserves the ability of unions to contribute via PAC money. I think it's a winner. We're trying to get Sanders to add abolition of corporate personhood to it. I think it's much better to work with members of Congress who are already there fighting for us than it is to bitch that they're not doing what we want exactly and expect them to follow us, especially when there's so many other citizens who disagree with Move to Amend. I'm not the only one, obviously.
David, do you have any remarks?
Yeah, I think Rick pretty much covered most of it, but I believe that if 2/3 of the state push for a constitutional amendment, we can go through the states rather than Congress.
Right. So what are your takes on? I guess it'd be interesting to hear. We're talking about this, government corruption concept, and the role that the two political parties play. Democrats and Republicans. Every sort of election that rolls around, it's like I feel like there's a lot of people which, end up having to ask themselves, why do I only have the right to vote for either one of these two parties? Why are they the only two parties that have a chance of winning? Can you guys elaborate on the role that our current government is playing with us in terms of just having a two-party political system? I mean, should there be room for these other smaller parties?
Yeah, when people complain about the two-party system, I'm honestly confused because it's really not about how many parties we have. The bigger issue is, do we have an informed electorate? And without an informed electorate, it doesn't matter if you have two parties or if you have 100 parties. It's really more about the voters becoming educated in terms of who they're voting for, what they're voting for, and best way to accelerate that information is to, fix the problem with the media by putting not even new regulations, but regulations that used to exist before Clinton signed the FCC deregulation law. We can fix the problem by taking money out of politics for the most part, and by focusing on improving civics in all levels of education. There's no silver bullet, but you have to tackle this from a lot of different angles.
Right now, Rick, do you feel the same way? I asked the question regarding, the two-party political system and how that plays a role in some of this government corruption. David doesn't really seem to agree that he thinks it's more about having a well-informed electorate. What's your take on how these two parties each election seem to really have total control over what any outcome is going to be?
Can you hear me? My camera's...
Yeah, I hear you just fine.
Okay, good. I'm with you, Max. I have to disagree with David on this one. I think that he's right about as far as he goes. We have to educate the electorate. But the electorate is resisting this because most people grow up in families where their parents are either Democratic or Republican, and now the atmosphere is so poisonous between the two groups that each regards the other essentially as the enemy. And they are not seeing that both parties are controlled by corporations, and in particular big banks. That's why the Obama administration is not prosecuting the bankers. That's why when the Justice Department does prosecute corporations, not individuals, hardly anybody's going to jail. And none of the big fish are, because they are the ones that control the government. They are the ones that start corporate profit. And to maintain us on dependence on oil and other fossil fuels. Here's the thing. The four biggest banks in the United States are also controlling or have huge financial interests in the four biggest oil companies. So you can't avoid concluding that foreign policy is dictated ultimately by these big banks. I just did a show on SFPI radio last week talking about this relationship between the banks and war. We're going to continue that next week. So if people want to know more about this, go to SFPI Radio on Blog Talk. You can get a link to last week's show and get ready to listen next week too. Saturdays at 1 p.m. Eastern.
Great.
So just to elaborate on that for a second more, the original, I got a little off the original point. The original point is, does the two-party system contribute to this? Absolutely. Because there's really only one party, the duopoly, the corporate party. There are members of Congress in the Democratic Party, and even I can think of at least one in the Republican Party, who are not controlled by these corporate interests. And those are the ones, people like Bernie Sanders, people like Walter Brown, who's a Republican from North Carolina. He co-sponsored an amendment to the Constitution. There are Republicans out there who are just as sick as Democrats of being forced to spend all their time campaign fundraising from corporate interests that they would rather not be serving. But they figure, hey, I can't get anything done if I'm not in Congress and I have to make this compromise. Well, you can't serve two masters. If you've taken that money and you feel you have to serve their interests and balance those against the interests of the American people, they'll always come out on top. And that's how we became a fascist government rather than a democracy.
Great. Raphael, did you have something that you wanted to bring up to either of the speakers?
Well, the last few moments, they've been talking about the large issue of constitutional amendments and not concentrating on the budget. And I do follow and concur with most of what has been said, but I wanted to see what kind of legislation can be worked out to smooth out the problems that are in the Congress right now, and then look at a long-term solution. We've been looking at a long-term solution, but I haven't seen anything in the present sense, like passing a budget, getting the gridlock out of the congressional legislative section of the government. In other countries, we have multiple parties, and there are multiple parties, and they do function. So, that's all I wanted to say right now.
Right.
Yeah, if I can respond to Raphael real quick, I would like to say that you can't really have a sensible budget passed in Congress if Congress is working for corporate interest. There's always going to be that conflict between politicians who, for the most part, are supporting the people versus those who are supporting corporations, and the conflict between getting reelected for the next election. And so you need that corporate money. Once you take that out, you have congressmen and senators who focus on the actual people's issues and people's interests. So that's a huge part of solving the budget problem, is by getting that money out and that corporate interest out of the equation.
One question I have is...
just a second, Raphael, can I respond to your comment too?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say that the solutions are already out there, and many of them have been introduced in Congress. They're being largely ignored by the corporate media and as much as possible by the leaders of both parties. We talked about health care. There have been a few people who've introduced single-payer legislation. Again, Bernie Sanders in the Senate, Dennis Kucinich in the House. The Democratic Party leadership pretended they never did it, but they got 96 co-sponsors in 2010. Meanwhile, the leaders ignored it and went on and gave us Obamacare, a bailout for the health insurance industry. So that's a huge part of the budget problem. We need single-payer health care. That will cut our roughly 10% of the GDP. That's a huge savings, because 60% of that comes from tax money, and the rest comes from individuals through premiums, copays, and deductibles. So that's number one. Number two, we are subsidizing the oil companies for exploration to the tune of billions of dollars a year. Exxon got $3 billion of taxpayer money after making record profits. Much of that derived from what we spend on war for their benefit to secure oil and natural gas. So we cut the costs, we eliminate those subsidies. That's also been introduced and ignored. We deal with health care, cut the military. Also, this is on the table with sequesters. Republicans and Democrats are fighting that, because they say, hey, we'll lose 150,000 jobs that are dependent on building the F-35, which is going to cost $2 trillion over the length of the life of that plane. The plane is absolutely unnecessary. There is no warplane in the world that can challenge the previous version of the F-fighter. I can't remember what it was, and we don't have any enemies powerful enough to challenge us anyway. We are allied with Britain, France, all the major powers outside of China, and to some extent Russia. And we are now picking on poorer countries, taking them out one by one: Libya, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, Mali, Sudan. All of those countries were targeted starting in 2000 by the Strategy for Rebuilding America's Defenses, which was developed by the Project for a New American Century. These are the neocons, the Cheneys, the Wolfowitzes, the international corporate terrorists who have a plan to take over the world. They laid it out 2000. It's happening right in front of us. You and I are paying for it. So if we cut the military budget, like this, there's nothing in terms of what we could cut from the military budget. But it ain't going to happen, because the military is what backs up the oil-based economy, and it also is the only thing backing up the dollar right now. The dollar would collapse if it weren't convertible into petroleum. These two things are intimately tied together. If the petrodollar falls and if countries start buying oil in other currencies, the dollar will fall. That's the only reason they're not doing it, because if the dollar falls, so does the euro and so does the yen. But they're working on ways around that. They're working on undermining the primacy of the U.S. dollar, because ultimately that is the cause of these wars that we're engaged in.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, guys. Go ahead, Raphael. Continue your discussion. I just want to let each of you know that in a few minutes I'll be having to start a new discussion in our first discussion on gay rights on Vonvo. So feel free to continue your discussion. I thought this was awesome, and I'm glad we got your camera working, Rick. David, thanks for joining, and I will be in touch with each of you. And David, I'm going to put my name in the text chat, and please feel free to friend me on Facebook. I don't know if we've connected yet. Okay?
I think we have.
Okay, sorry. I just can't keep track anymore. But go ahead. Go ahead, Raphael.
I was wondering, everyone has brought up the name corporation. And what I know from business is a company gets started and they grow. And as they grow, they expand to different locations. And through reasons of accounting, they change into a corporation. And that turns that corporation from a individual to an entity that's lifelong. Now, are you suggesting that certain size corporations be dissolved, that a person can build up a business, have a corporation, and then after a certain gross or net profit, they have to dissolve it as a corporation? They can't contribute to any Sierra Club or to any political organization. I'm not disagreeing with